The transport ship hummed quietly as it approached Kepler 442b. Jake Martinez pressed his face against the small window and watched the alien world grow larger. The planet looked different from Earth. Instead of blue oceans, there were purple seas. The land masses were covered in strange crystal formations that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. "First time seeing an alien world?" asked Lisa Park, sitting in the seat next to him. She was a biology student from Oregon with short brown hair and curious green eyes. Like Jake, she was 19 years old and part of the first human group to join the interspecies exchange program. "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice filled with wonder. "It's incredible. Look at those crystal forests." He pointed to areas where tall, transparent structures rose from the ground like frozen trees. Danny Wright leaned over from across the aisle. The physics student from Texas was tall and thin, with messy blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "The gravity is about 80% of Earth's," he said. "That should make moving around easier for us." The ship landed with a soft thud at the spaceport. As the doors opened, Jake felt a rush of alien air. It smelled like cinnamon and metal. The three humans grabbed their bags and walked down the ramp together. Waiting for them at the bottom was Professor Velquan, their host and instructor. The Zephyrion was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Professor Velquan stood about 7 feet tall, but looked lightweight, almost fragile. His skin was pale blue with silver markings that ran along his arms and face. His hands and feet were larger than human proportions, with what looked like suction cups on the fingertips and toes. "Welcome to Kepler 442b, Professor Velquan said in perfectly clear English. His voice had a musical quality that made even simple words sound elegant. "I am Professor Velquan. I will be your guide and teacher during your stay here." Jake stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'm Jake Martinez." "Nice to meet you, Professor." Professor Velquan looked at Jake's outstretched hand with curiosity, then carefully shook it. His grip was gentle but firm. "Ah, yes, the human greeting ritual. I have studied your species but never met humans in person. You are heavier than I expected." "This is Lisa Park," Jake said, gesturing to his companion. "She studies biology." "And I'm Danny Wright," the third human added. "I study physics." Professor Velquan nodded to each of them. "Excellent. Your studies will be useful here. Come, let me introduce you to your fellow students." They walked through the spaceport, which was built from the same crystal-like material that covered much of the planet. The walls were transparent, giving Jake the feeling of walking through a giant gem. Other beings moved through the corridors, some floating, others walking on multiple legs. Jake tried not to stare, but everything was so new and strange. They entered a large room where 3 other students waited. These were Zephyrions like Professor Velquan, but younger and smaller. They had the same pale blue skin and silver markings, the same large hands and feet with suction cup fingers. "These are Krillvex, Thanemore, and Zilfen," Professor Velquan said. "They are my best students, chosen for this program because of their skills and open minds." Krillvex was the first to speak. She was about Jake's height, but much thinner, with intricate silver patterns on her arms. "So these are the humans we have heard about. They look so heavy and slow." Thanemore, who was slightly taller than the others, studied the humans with interest. "Their hands are small. How do they grip things properly?" Zilfen was the youngest looking of the 3. He seemed shy but curious. "Do they really come from a world with such strong gravity?" "Yes," Professor Velquan answered. "Earth's gravity is 20% stronger than ours. These humans have adapted to much harsher conditions than we have." Jake felt a bit uncomfortable being talked about like he wasn't there, but he understood that this was probably normal when meeting alien species. "We're excited to learn about your world," he said, "and we hope to share what we know about ours." Professor Velquan smiled, which looked strange on his alien features. "That is exactly the purpose of this exchange program. For too long, our species have developed in isolation. Now we can learn from each other." He led them through more crystal corridors to a briefing room. The walls showed images of various landscapes from the planet. There were crystal forests, methane swamps, floating islands, and towering cliff faces that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. For the next month, you will learn survival techniques from different environments on our world, Professor Velquan explained. You will study our plants, our weather patterns, and our geological formations. Most importantly, you will learn to work together as a team, Lisa raised her hand. What kinds of challenges will we face? Many kinds, Professor Velquan replied. You will navigate the crystal forests, where the trees are sharp and the paths change with the light. You will cross the methane swamps, where the ground can dissolve beneath your feet. You will climb the floating islands, where the only way up is through careful planning and teamwork. Danny adjusted his glasses. It sounds dangerous. All learning involves some risk, Professor Velquan said. But we have safety measures in place. The real danger is not physical. It is the danger of giving up when faced with what seems impossible. Krillvex leaned forward. Are you telling them about the Ascension trial? Professor Velquan nodded slowly. Yes, the final challenge of your time here will be the Ascension trial. It is a test that has been part of our education for thousands of years. What is it? Jake asked. You will climb the Shard of Eternity, Professor Velquan said. Images on the wall showed a massive cliff face that rose straight up into the clouds. The surface looked smooth and glassy, reflecting the sky like a mirror. It is a vertical cliff that rises 800 meters into the sky. The rock is smoother than glass and offers almost no handholds. Jake stared at the image. Even with his engineering background, he couldn't imagine how anyone could climb something so smooth and tall. How is it possible? That is what you must discover, Professor Velquan replied. The Ascension trial is not just about reaching the top. It is about learning to think beyond your limitations. Fainmore looked proud. My species has been climbing these cliffs for generations. Our hands and feet are perfectly designed for it. Yet the Shard of Eternity has defeated many of our best climbers, Professor Velquan said quietly. It is not enough to have the right body, you must have the right mind. They spent the rest of the day getting settled in their quarters. The rooms were simple but comfortable, with beds that were softer than anything Jake had ever experienced. The walls were transparent, offering a view of the alien landscape outside. That evening, the 6 students ate dinner together in the dining hall. The food was strange but tasty, with flavors that Jake couldn't identify. The Zephyrian students asked many questions about Earth, while the humans learned about daily life on Kepler 442b. Your species builds tools for everything, Zilfen observed. We heard that humans cannot climb trees without special equipment. That's true, Lisa admitted. We're not natural climbers like you are. Then how do you expect to complete the Ascension trial? Krillvex asked. Jake thought about this. Back on Earth, when faced with a problem, humans usually found a way around it. They built ladders to reach high places, bridges to cross rivers, and machines to do work that their bodies couldn't handle. But here, on this alien world, he wasn't sure what tools or materials would be available. I guess we'll figure it out when we get there, he said. The Zephyrian students exchanged glances. Thanemore shook his head. The Ascension trial is not about figuring things out. It is about pushing your body to its limits and beyond. Maybe, Jake replied. But there's usually more than one way to solve a problem. Professor Velquan watched this exchange with interest. He had studied human behavior in books and recordings, but seeing it in person was different. These humans seemed confident even when faced with challenges that should terrify them. They talked about problems as if they were puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to overcome. Over the next few days, the group began their training in the different environments of Kepler 442b. The crystal forests were beautiful but dangerous, with sharp edges that could cut through their protective suits. The methane swamps were thick and poisonous, requiring special breathing equipment and careful navigation. Through it all, Jake noticed something interesting. The Zephyrian students excelled at challenges that matched their natural abilities. They could climb crystal formations with ease, their suction cup fingers gripping surfaces that the humans found impossible to hold. But when faced with problems that required different approaches, They sometimes struggled. The humans, on the other hand, seemed to adapt more quickly to unexpected situations. When Lisa couldn't climb a crystal tree, she found a way to use the flexible branches to swing across a gap. When Danny couldn't grip a smooth surface, he used his belt to create a makeshift rope. When Jake faced a wall that was too high to climb, he stacked rocks to make steps. Professor Velquan noticed this too. The humans approached every challenge by asking, "How can we make this work?" rather than "Can we do this?" It was a subtle difference, but an important one. As the training period continued, Jake found himself thinking more and more about the Ascension trial. The morning of the Ascension trial arrived with a strange purple sunrise. Jake woke early and looked out his window at the distant shard of eternity. Even from miles away, the massive cliff looked impossible to climb. It rose straight up from the ground like a giant wall of black glass, disappearing into the clouds above. After breakfast, the group loaded into Professor Velquan's transport vehicle. The ride to the base of the cliff took 2 hours through crystal forests and rocky plains. Nobody spoke much during the journey. Even the confident Zephyrian students seemed nervous. When they finally arrived, Jake felt his stomach drop. The cliff was even more intimidating up close. It stretched up so high that he had to bend his neck all the way back to see the top. The surface was perfectly smooth, like looking into a dark mirror. There were no cracks, no ledges, no handholds of any kind. "This is the Shard of Eternity," Professor Velquan announced as they stepped out of the vehicle. "It has stood here for millions of years. The rock is harder than diamond and smoother than glass." Lisa walked up to the cliff face and placed her hand against it. "It's incredible. How was it formed?" "Ancient volcanic activity," Professor Velquan explained. "The molten rock cooled very slowly, creating this perfect surface. Many have tried to climb it, few have succeeded." Danny pushed his glasses up his nose and studied the cliff. 800 meters straight up. That's almost half a mile. "The record holder is my grandfather," Krillvex said proudly. "He made it to the top in 6 hours. But that was 40 years ago, when the surface had more texture." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Time and weather have worn the cliff smoother," Thanemore explained. "Each year it becomes harder to climb. The small cracks and bumps that our ancestors used are gone now," Professor Velquan nodded sadly. "This is why the Ascension trial has become so difficult. What was challenging for previous generations is nearly impossible for this one." Zilfan looked up at the cliff with wide eyes. "Maybe we should try a different test." "No," Professor Velquan said firmly. "The Ascension trial teaches us that some challenges cannot be avoided, they must be faced." The professor led them to a small equipment area near the base of the cliff. There were safety harnesses, emergency medical supplies, and a large net system that would catch anyone who fell. Jake noticed that there were no ropes, no climbing tools, no ladders, just basic safety equipment. "The rules are simple," Professor Velquan said. "You must reach the top using only your body and mind. No artificial aids are allowed. You may attempt the climb individually or work together as a team." Krillvex stepped forward confidently. "I will go first." She put on a safety harness and approached the cliff. Her large hands pressed against the smooth surface, and Jake could see the suction cups on her fingertips trying to find grip. Slowly, she began to climb. For the first 50 meters, Krillvex moved steadily upward. Her technique was beautiful to watch. She used her hands and feet in perfect coordination, distributing her weight carefully across the smooth surface. Jake could see why the Zephyrians were natural climbers, but as she climbed higher, her progress slowed. The cliff became even smoother, and her suction cups began to slip. At about 100 meters, she paused, pressing her body against the rock face. "Come on, Krillvex," Thanemore called from below. "You can do it." She tried to continue, stretching her arm up to find a new grip. For a moment, it looked like she might succeed. But then her left hand slipped, and she swung sideways. She managed to hold on for a few seconds before her right hand gave way. Krillvex fell backward, her safety line catching her and lowering her gently to the ground. She landed in the net system, frustrated and disappointed. "The surface is Too smooth, she said, breathing hard. There's nothing to grip. Thane Moore went next. He was stronger than Krillvex and made it to about 150 meters before falling. His technique was different, using more strength and less finesse. But the result was the same. Zia Ylfen was the most careful of the three. He studied the cliff face for a long time before starting his climb. He moved very slowly, testing each grip carefully. He made it to about 80 meters before his hands began to slip. I can't hold on, he called down. The rock is like ice. He fell back into the net, looking defeated. Professor Velquan watched his students with growing concern. Try again, he encouraged. Think about what you learned from the first attempt. Krillvex made a second attempt, this time trying to use her feet more than her hands. She reached about 120 meters before falling again. Thane Moore tried a different approach, moving in a zigzag pattern to distribute his weight better. He made it to 160 meters but still couldn't continue after several more attempts. All three Zephyrian students sat on the ground, exhausted and discouraged. They had tried everything they could think of, but the cliff remained unconquerable. It's impossible, Krillvex said, her voice filled with defeat. The cliff is too smooth now. Maybe it was possible in the past, but not anymore. Perhaps the trial needs to be changed, Thane Moore suggested. This challenge is beyond what any student can accomplish. Zilfen nodded in agreement. We should find a different way to test ourselves. Professor Velquan looked troubled. The Ascension trial had been part of Zephyrian education for thousands of years. It was meant to teach students that they could overcome any obstacle with determination and skill. But watching his best students fail repeatedly made him wonder if the challenge had truly become impossible. While the Zephyrian students rested, Jake walked along the base of the cliff. He studied the smooth surface, looking for any features that might be useful. The rock was indeed incredibly smooth, but it wasn't perfectly uniform. There were subtle variations in color and texture about every 50 meters up the cliff face. Jake noticed thin horizontal lines. They were barely visible, but they seemed to mark layers in the rock formation. He also noticed that there were small plants growing in some of these lines, tiny green shoots that had somehow found purchase in the microscopic cracks. What are you looking at? Lisa asked, joining him. These lines, Jake said, pointing up. They're not very deep, but they're there, and see those plants? They're growing in the cracks. Lisa studied the vegetation with interest. They look like some kind of vine. They must be incredibly strong to grow in such a harsh environment. Danny walked over to them, carrying a small rock. I've been testing the surface, he said. It's definitely smooth, but it's not frictionless. There's just not enough texture for normal climbing techniques. What are you thinking? Jake asked. I'm thinking about mechanical advantage, Danny replied. If you can't grip the surface with your hands, maybe you need to approach the problem differently. Professor Velquan overheard their conversation and approached them. Do you have an idea about how to climb the cliff? Maybe, Jake said. But we need to study it more. You are welcome to try, Professor Velquan said. But remember, you must use only your body and mind. No artificial aids are allowed. Jake nodded, but his mind was already working on possibilities. He had noticed something that the Zephyrian students hadn't considered. They were all thinking about the climb as an individual challenge, using only their natural abilities. But what if the solution required a different approach? As the day continued, the Zephyrian students made several more attempts. Each time they reached about the same height before falling. Their confidence was completely shattered. They began to argue among themselves about whether the trial was fair. This is not a test of skill, Krillvex said angrily. It's a test of the impossible. Maybe that's the point, Thane Moore replied. Maybe we're supposed to learn that some things cannot be done. That's not a useful lesson, Zilfen protested. What's the point of learning that we should give up? Professor Velquan listened to his students with a heavy heart. He had always believed that the Ascension trial taught important lessons about perseverance and pushing beyond one's limits. But seeing his students become so discouraged made him question whether the challenge had become counterproductive. Meanwhile, the three humans continued to examine the cliff and the surrounding area. Lisa collected samples of the plants growing in the horizontal cracks. Danny made calculations about weight distribution and friction coefficients. Jake studied the rock formation and looked for any materials that might be useful. "The vines are interesting," Lisa said, showing her samples to the others. "They're incredibly strong for their size, and look at this." She pulled on one of the vines, and it stretched without breaking. "They're elastic, too. That's useful," Jake said. "What else can you tell me about them?" "They grow in long strands," Lisa explained. "Some of them are 20 or 30 feet long, and they seem to be designed to handle stress. They probably have to deal with strong winds up on the cliff face." Danny looked at the vine samples with interest. "If they're strong enough to grow in the cracks, they might be strong enough to support weight." "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Jake asked. "Probably," Danny replied with a grin. "But let's make sure we understand the physics before we try anything." As the sun began to set, Professor Velquan called an end to the day's attempts. The Zephyrian students had tried everything they could think of, but the cliff remained unconquered. The next morning, Jake woke up before dawn with a clear plan in his mind. He had spent most of the night thinking about the cliff, the vines, and the physics of climbing. While the Zephyrian students saw an impossible wall, Jake saw an engineering problem that needed the right tools and approach. He found Lisa and Danny in the dining hall, both looking tired but excited. They had been working on the same problem from their different perspectives. "I've been thinking about the vines all night," Lisa said quietly, not wanting the Zephyrian students to overhear. "I collected more samples yesterday evening. These plants are amazing. They're stronger than steel cable for their weight," Danny nodded enthusiastically. "And I've been running calculations. If we can create anchor points every 50 meters, we can build a support system that would work." "The horizontal cracks in the rock," Jake added. "They're perfect for anchoring." "The vines growing there prove that the cracks go deep enough to hold weight." The three humans finished breakfast quickly and headed back to the cliff before the others were ready. They wanted to test their ideas without drawing attention from the discouraged Zephyrian students. At the base of the cliff, Lisa began gathering more vines. She had learned to identify the strongest ones by their color and texture. The best vines were dark green with a slightly rough surface that provided good grip. "These are perfect," she said, pulling a long vine from a crack about 10 feet up the cliff face. "Look how long this one is." She held up a vine that was nearly 40 feet long and as thick as her thumb. Danny examined the vine carefully. "It's flexible but not stretchy. That's good for load bearing." He tied one end to a rock and pulled hard. The vine held without any sign of breaking. Jake was studying the cliff face, looking for the best places to create anchor points. The horizontal cracks were spaced irregularly, but there was usually one every 40 to 60 feet. That was perfect for their plan. "I need to test something," Jake said. He put on a safety harness and began climbing the smooth cliff face. But unlike the Zephyrian students, he wasn't trying to reach the top. He was only going to the first horizontal crack. Using his hands and feet, Jake slowly worked his way up the smooth surface. His technique was different from the Zephyrians. Instead of relying on suction cup fingers, he used friction and body positioning. It was harder work, but he made steady progress. At about 15 feet up, he reached the first horizontal crack. It was only about an inch deep, but it ran across the entire width of the cliff face. Small plants grew in the crack, their roots anchored deep in the rock. Jake carefully pulled some of the plants out of the crack and examined the space behind them. The crack was deeper than it looked from below, going back into the rock for several inches. It was perfect for what he needed. He rappelled back down to where Lisa and Danny waited. "It'll work," he said, breathing hard from the climb. "The cracks are deep enough to hold anchors, and they're spaced well enough to create a support system." "What kind of anchors?" Danny asked. Jake picked up a piece of the crystalline rock that littered the ground around the cliff. It was hard and had sharp edges that could be wedged into cracks. We can use these rocks as anchors. Drive them deep into the cracks and tie the vines to them. Lisa examined the rock pieces. They're the right shape, and the crystal structure looks strong enough to handle the stress. But we need tools to drive them in, Danny pointed out. We can't just push them into the cracks by hand. Jake looked around the base of the cliff. There was plenty of debris from old expeditions, including some metal pieces that had been left behind. He picked up a heavy metal rod that was about 2 feet long. This will work as a hammer, he said. We can use it to drive the rock anchors into the cracks. The 3 humans spent the next hour collecting materials and preparing their equipment. They gathered the strongest vines they could find, selected the best rock pieces for anchors, and tested their improvised hammer. By the time Professor Velquan and the Zephyrian students arrived, the humans had everything ready. What are you doing? Krillvex asked, looking at the pile of vines and rocks. We're going to try a different approach, Jake said simply. Feynmore looked skeptical. You're going to climb the cliff with plants? Not exactly, Lisa replied. We're going to build a support system. Professor Velquan studied the materials with interest. Are these natural materials from the cliff area? Yes, Jake confirmed. The vines grow in the cracks and the rocks are from the base of the cliff. We're not bringing anything artificial. Then you are following the rules, Professor Velquan said. You may proceed. Zilfen looked confused. But how will plants help you climb? Watch and see, Danny said with a smile. Jake put on his safety harness and began climbing toward the first horizontal crack. This time, he carried a bag with vine lengths, rock anchors, and the metal rod. The extra weight made the climb harder, but he managed to reach the crack after about 10 minutes. Once there, Jake began working. He selected a sharp piece of crystal rock and positioned it in the deepest part of the crack, using the metal rod. As a hammer, he drove the rock anchor deep into the crevice. The sound of metal hitting rock echoed across the cliff face. What is he doing? Krillvex asked from below. He's creating an anchor point, Danny explained, a place to attach the vines. After several minutes of work, Jake had the first anchor firmly in place. He tied one end of his strongest vine to the rock anchor, testing it by pulling hard. The anchor held solid. Jake let the other end of the vine drop down to the ground, where Lisa and Danny caught it. First anchor is secure, Jake called down. I'm going to the next crack. Using the vine as a safety line, Jake continued climbing. The rope took some of his weight, making the ascent easier. He reached the second horizontal crack at about 60 feet up and repeated the process, driving in another rock anchor and attaching another vine. The Zephyrian students watched with growing fascination. They had never seen anyone approach the cliff this way before. He's building a ladder, Feynmore said with amazement. But using natural materials? It's more than a ladder, Professor Velquan observed. It's a support system. The vines will help distribute weight and provide safety lines. Jake continued working his way up the cliff, creating anchor points every 50 to 60 feet. At each level, he would drive in a rock anchor, attach a vine, and test the system before moving higher. The work was slow and careful. Each anchor had to be placed perfectly and each vine had to be tied securely. But Jake's engineering background helped him understand the forces involved and how to distribute the load properly. By midday, Jake had created 5 anchor points reaching about 250 feet up the cliff. That was higher than any of the Zephyrian students had managed. It's working, Lisa said excitedly. The system is holding his weight. The physics are sound, Danny added. Each anchor point reduces the load on the ones below it. Jake rappelled back down to the ground to rest and eat lunch. The Zephyrian students crowded around him, full of questions. How did you think of this? Zilfen asked. It's what humans do, Jake replied. When we can't do something with our bodies alone, we build tools to help us. But those aren't tools, Krillvex protested. They're just plants and rocks. Everything is a tool if you use it right, Lisa explained. The vine becomes a rope, the rock becomes an anchor, the metal rod becomes a hammer. Professor Velquan listened to this exchange with deep interest. You see the cliff not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a problem to solve. Exactly, Jake said. The cliff hasn't changed, but our approach to it has. After lunch, Jake began the second phase of his plan. Instead of climbing alone, he would bring Lisa and Danny up with him using the support system. Are you sure it will hold all of us? Lisa asked. The vines are strong enough, Jake replied. And the anchor points are spaced to distribute the weight. It should work. Danny checked his calculations one more time. The load distribution looks good. Each anchor point will only carry about 1/3 of the total weight. Jake went up first, using the vine system to make the climb easier. Once he reached the first anchor point, he secured a safety line for Lisa. She began climbing, using both the smooth cliff face and the vine for support. The combination worked perfectly. Lisa's biology background helped her understand how to move efficiently, while the vine system provided the security she needed. She reached the first anchor point much faster than Jake had on his original climb. Danny followed, using his physics knowledge to optimize his climbing technique. The three humans worked together, with Jake leading and setting up new anchor points while Lisa and Danny provided support from below. The Zephyrian students watched in amazement as the humans climbed higher and higher. They were moving faster and more safely than any individual climber had ever managed. They're working as a team, Thane Moore observed. Each one has a different skill, but they're combining them. Look how they communicate, Krillvex added. They're constantly talking to each other, sharing information. They're not just climbing the cliff, Zilfen said with wonder. They're changing it, Professor Velquan nodded thoughtfully. They're demonstrating that intelligence can overcome natural limitations. This is what the Ascension trial was meant to teach. As the afternoon progressed, the humans continued their steady ascent. The second day of climbing began with heavy purple clouds gathering around the upper part of the cliff. Jake looked up from the ledge where he had spent the night and felt a knot of worry in his stomach. They were now 500 feet up the shard of eternity, but the hardest part still lay ahead. Weather's changing, Danny observed, adjusting his glasses as he peered upward. The three humans had made a small camp on a narrow ledge, using their vine system as both shelter and safety line. Lisa checked her samples of the local plants. The wind patterns are different up here. The vines are growing in different directions, following the air currents. Jake studied the cliff face above them. The rock looked even smoother than the lower sections, polished by centuries of wind and weather. But worse than that, about 50 feet above their current position, the cliff actually curved outward, creating an overhang. That's going to be a problem, Jake said, pointing to the overhang. There's no way to climb directly up through that section. From the ground far below, Professor Velquan's voice reached them through a communication device. The overhang has defeated many climbers over the years. It extends outward for about 20 feet before the cliff face becomes vertical again. The Zephyrian students had climbed up to the first few anchor points using the human-built vine system. They were amazed at how much easier it made the ascent, but they were still far below the humans. How will you get past the overhang? Krillvex called up to them. Jake examined the problem carefully. The overhang meant that he couldn't place an anchor point directly above their current position. Any attempt to climb straight up would result in hanging upside down from the rock ceiling, which would be impossible to maintain for long. We need to think about this differently, Jake said to his companions. Instead of going straight up, maybe we need to go sideways first. Danny pulled out his notebook and began sketching the cliff structure. If we could swing across to the side, we might find a better path around the overhang. Swing across? Lisa asked. Like on a rope? Exactly, Jake replied, his mind already working on the mechanics. The vines have an elasticity. If we can create enough momentum, we might be able to pendulum across to a better position. The idea was risky. It would require perfect timing and complete trust in their equipment. But Jake could see that it was their only option for getting past the overhang. He began preparing for the attempt by testing the elasticity of their strongest vine. The plant fiber stretched under tension but always returned to its original length. It was like a natural bungee cord. I'll need to drop down about 30 feet to get enough swing distance, Jake explained to the others. Then use the momentum to carry me across to that section over there. He pointed to an area about 40 feet to the right where the cliff face looked more normal. That's dangerous, Danny said, checking his calculations. If you miss the target area, you'll swing back and hit the cliff face hard. I know, Jake replied, but it's the only way forward. Lisa examined the vine that would serve as his swing line. This one is our strongest. It should hold your weight easily. But are you sure about the angle? Jake studied the geometry of the swing one more time. The physics were complicated, but he had done similar calculations in engineering classes back on Earth. The angle looks right. I'll have enough momentum to reach the target area if I time it correctly. Far below, the Zephyrian students watched with growing concern. They had never seen anyone attempt such a maneuver on the Shard of Eternity. This is madness, Thane Moore said. No one swings across cliff faces. The humans do, Professor Valquan replied quietly. They approach problems in ways we never consider. Jake attached the vine securely to his harness and checked all his knots twice. The safety systems that Danny had designed would prevent him from falling all the way to the ground, but they wouldn't help if he hit the cliff face during his swing. Ready? Jake asked his teammates. Be careful, Lisa said. Trust the math, Danny added. Jake took a deep breath and stepped backward off the ledge. For a moment he hung in space, suspended by the vine. Then he began to fall, picking up speed as gravity pulled him downward. The vine stretched under his weight, absorbing the energy of his fall. When it reached maximum extension, it began to contract, launching Jake upward and across the cliff. Faced like a human projectile, the wind rushed past his ears as he swung through the air. Below him, the ground looked impossibly far away. Ahead of him, the cliff face rushed toward him at alarming speed. Jake hit the rock wall with his feet, absorbing the impact with his legs. For a moment, he bounced away from the cliff, but then his hands found purchase on the rock surface. He was exactly where he had aimed to be. It worked. Lisa shouted from across the gap. Jake quickly examined his new position. The cliff face here was still smooth, but there was a horizontal crack just above him where he could place a new anchor point. More importantly, this section of the cliff was vertical rather than overhanging. Working quickly, Jake drove a new rock anchor into the crack and secured a vine to it. Now he had created a bridge across the most difficult part of the cliff. Sending a line across, Jake called to his teammates. He tied a vine to his new anchor point and threw the other end across the gap to Lisa and Danny. Danny caught the vine and tested its strength. This will work. We can use it as a guideline to cross the gap. One by one, Lisa and Danny used the vine bridge to swing across the overhang. The technique was scary, but it worked perfectly. Soon all three humans were reunited on the far side of the most challenging obstacle. From below, the Zephyrian students cheered. They had watched the impossible maneuver with amazement and excitement. Did you see that? Zilfen said excitedly. They flew across the gap like birds. Not like birds, Krillvex corrected, like engineers. Professor Velquan smiled at this comment. His students were beginning to understand something important about the human approach to problem-solving. As the day continued, Jake, Lisa, and Danny made steady progress up the remaining cliff face. The overhang had been the most difficult obstacle, but there were still challenges ahead. At 600 feet, they encountered a section where the rock was covered with a thin layer of ice from the clouds above. The surface became incredibly slippery, making it almost impossible to maintain any grip. The ice changes everything, Lisa observed. Even our anchor points might not hold properly in these conditions. Danny studied the problem from a physics perspective. Ice has different friction properties than rock. We need to modify our technique. Jake experimented with different approaches. He found that by moving very slowly and testing each grip carefully, he could still make progress. But the ice made everything more dangerous. We need better tools. For this section, Jake said. Something that can grip ice better than our hands and feet. Lisa looked around for materials they could use. She found some sharp pieces of crystal rock that had been frozen into the ice. These might work as improvised ice picks. Using the crystal fragments, the humans were able to chip handholds into the icy surface. It was slow work, but it allowed them to continue climbing safely. As they worked their way through the ice section, something remarkable happened below them. The Zephyrian students began to follow their example, using the vine system to climb higher than they had ever managed. Before, Krulvex was the first to attempt using the human-built anchor points. She found that the combination of her natural climbing ability and the artificial support system made her much more capable than before. "This is incredible," she called up to the humans. "I can climb sections that were impossible yesterday." They more. And Zilfan quickly followed her example. They discovered that the vine system didn't just make climbing safer, it made them better climbers. They could take risks and try new techniques because they knew the safety lines would catch them if they fell. "We're learning from them," Zilfan said as he successfully navigated a difficult section. "They're teaching us new ways to think about climbing." Professor Velquan watched his students with pride and amazement. The humans had not just solved the climbing problem. They had created a learning opportunity for everyone. By late afternoon, Jake, Lisa, and Danny reached 700 feet up the cliff. They were now higher than anyone had climbed the Shard of Eternity in decades. The summit was finally within reach, but as they prepared for the final push to the top, the weather began to change again. The purple clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened up, sending a light rain down the cliff face. The rain made the smooth rock surface even more slippery than before. Worse, it began to freeze as it hit the cold rock, creating a thin layer of ice over everything. "This is dangerous," Danny said, watching ice form on their equipment. "The anchor points might not hold if the ice gets too thick." Jake looked up at the remaining 100 feet of cliff. The summit was so close, but the weather was making it incredibly hazardous to continue. "We need to make a decision," he said. "Do we wait for better weather, or do we push forward carefully?" Lisa examined their equipment. The vines were holding up well, but the metal components were starting to ice over. "Our gear should hold for a little while longer. The Zephyrians are counting on us," Danny pointed out. "If we can reach the summit, we'll prove that the Ascension trial is still possible." The final 100 feet of the Shard of Eternity proved to be the most challenging yet. Ice continued to form on the cliff face as Jake, Lisa, and Danny carefully worked their way upward through the freezing rain. Each grip had to be tested multiple times, and every anchor point required extra attention to ensure it would hold in the slippery conditions. Jake moved slowly, chipping away ice with crystal fragments to create handholds. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he forced himself to maintain perfect concentration. One mistake at this height could be fatal, even with their safety systems. "Anchor point secure at 750 feet, Jake called down to his teammates. He had driven another rock anchor deep into a horizontal crack and tested it thoroughly. The vine stretched down through the misty air to where Lisa and Danny waited. "Looking good from here," Danny replied, checking the tension on all their support lines. "The load distribution is holding perfectly." Lisa was studying the weather patterns around them. "The rain is getting lighter. I think we might be climbing into clearer air." She was right. As they climbed higher, the freezing rain gradually stopped. The air became thinner and clearer, and Jake could finally see the actual summit of the cliff above them. It was only about 50 feet away now, a flat platform of dark rock that had been worn smooth by millions of years of wind. But more importantly, Jake could see something else. There were marks in the rock near the summit, ancient carvings that had been left by previous climbers. The Shard of Eternity had been conquered before, just not recently. "There are symbols up here," Jake called down excitedly. "Carvings from other climbers." Far below, Professor Velquan heard this through the communication device. His voice carried a mixture of amazement and emotion. "Those carvings are from my grandfather's generation. No one has seen them in 40 years. Jake felt a surge of energy as he realized they were about to complete something that hadn't been done in decades. He placed his final anchor point just below the summit and secured the last vine in their system. "Ready for the final push," he announced. The last 50 feet went quickly. The summit platform was large enough for several people, and Jake was able to pull himself up onto solid, level ground for the first time in 2 days. He stood up carefully, his legs shaky from the long climb, and looked around at the incredible view. From the top of the Shard of Eternity, Jake could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. The crystal forest sparkled like jewels in the distance. The purple seas reflected the alien sky, and far below, he could see the tiny figures of his companions and the Zephyrian students, but Jake's first action wasn't to celebrate. Instead, he immediately began securing additional anchor points around the summit platform. He drove several rock anchors into cracks around the edge and created a network of safety lines. "Summit secured," he called down, sending additional lines for Lisa and Danny. Using the anchor points he had just created, Jake lowered several vines down to his teammates. This gave them multiple support lines for the final ascent. Lisa came up next, using the vine system with her natural agility and knowledge of plant behavior. She reached the summit much faster than Jake had, arriving with energy to spare. "This is incredible," she said, looking out at the alien landscape spread below them. "The view is worth every bit of the climb." Danny joined them a few minutes later. The physics student was breathing hard but grinning widely. The engineering worked perfectly. Every calculation, every anchor point, every load distribution, it all came together exactly as planned. The three humans stood together on the summit of the Shard of Eternity, the first people to reach this height in 40 years. But instead of keeping the achievement to themselves, they immediately began working to share it with others. "We need to make the system permanent," Jake said. "Other climbers should be able to use what we've built." They spent the next hour reinforcing their vine network, adding additional anchor points, and creating a detailed system that would last for years. Jake used his engineering knowledge to design redundant safety features. Lisa selected the strongest and most durable vines for the permanent installation. Danny calculated the optimal spacing and load distribution for long-term use. When they were finished, they had created something that was more than just a climbing route. They had built a bridge between the impossible and the achievable. "Ready to bring the others up?" Jake asked. "Let's do it," Lisa replied, using their communication device. They called down to Professor Velquan and the Zephyrian students. "The route is secure and ready for additional climbers. Who wants to try?" The response from below was immediate and enthusiastic. All three Zephyrian students wanted to attempt the climb using the human-built system. Krillvex was the first to try. Using the vine network, she climbed with a confidence and speed that amazed everyone. The combination of her natural climbing ability and the artificial support system made her incredibly capable. She reached sections that had defeated her completely just 2 days before. "This is wonderful," she called up as she passed the 400-foot mark. "I can focus on technique instead of just trying not to fall." Thane Moore followed close behind. He discovered that the vine system allowed him to attempt climbing moves that were too risky without safety lines. He began experimenting with new techniques, using the support lines to try difficult maneuvers. "I'm learning things about climbing that I never knew before," he said as he reached the 500-foot level. "The safety lines let me take risks and push my limits." Zilfen was more cautious, but he made steady progress. The shy student found that the vine system gave him confidence he had never felt before on the cliff face. He could try difficult sections knowing that he wouldn't fall far if he made a mistake. One by one, all three Zephyrian students reached the summit of the Shard of Eternity. They stood alongside the humans, looking out at their world from a height they had never imagined reaching. "How does it feel?" Jake asked Krillvex as she caught her breath on the summit platform. "Different," she replied thoughtfully. "I always thought climbing was about individual strength and ability. But this showed me that it can be about cooperation and innovation too." Thane Moore nodded in agreement. "We were so focused on doing things the traditional way that we couldn't see new possibilities. The humans taught us that limitations can be overcome," Zilfen added. "Not by becoming stronger, but by becoming smarter." Professor Velquan was the last to make the climb. Despite his age, he used the vine system with grace and dignity. When he reached the summit, there were tears in his large alien eyes. "I never thought I would see the top of the Shard of Eternity again," he said quietly. "My grandfather brought me here when I was young, but that was before the cliff became so smooth." He walked over to the ancient carvings that Jake had discovered and traced them with his finger. "These symbols tell the story of previous climbers. Now we must add our own story." Using a sharp piece of crystal, Professor Velquan carefully carved new symbols into the rock. They represented not just the successful climb, but the cooperation between species and the power of innovative thinking. As the group prepared to descend, Jake looked back at the vine network they had created. The system stretched down the cliff face like a vertical highway. Each anchor point a testament to human ingenuity and alien cooperation. "This will change everything," Professor Velquan said, following Jake's gaze. "Future students will learn, not just about climbing, but about problem-solving and teamwork." "That's the idea," Jake replied. "Every generation should build on what came before." The descent was much easier than the climb up. The vine system provided multiple safety lines and support points, making the journey down almost enjoyable. The group moved together, helping each other and sharing techniques. When they finally reached the ground, a celebration began. But it wasn't just a celebration of reaching the summit. It was a celebration of learning, of cooperation, and of the discovery that impossible challenges could become possible with the right approach. Professor Velquan announced that the Ascension trial would continue, but with new rules. Future students would be required to maintain and improve the vine system, learning about engineering, biology, and physics in the process. The challenge would remain difficult, but it would no longer be impossible. "The humans have given us a great gift," he said to the assembled group. "They have shown us that intelligence and cooperation can overcome any obstacle." In the weeks that followed, word of the successful climb spread throughout the Zephyrian educational system. Other schools requested visits from the human students to learn about their problem-solving techniques. The exchange program expanded rapidly as more species wanted to learn from human approaches to challenges. Jake, Lisa, and Danny became legends, but not for the reasons they expected. They were remembered not for their individual achievements, but for demonstrating that the greatest human strength was the ability to build systems that empowered everyone. The Shard of Eternity still rose majestically into the sky, its dark surface reflecting the purple clouds above. But now it was crossed by a network of vines that would help generations of students reach heights they never thought possible.